This is Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Mariam Namazi. You're watching the NewsHour live from London. Coming up, a nation in mourning. The hunt for survivors goes on in Beirut 2 days after a devastating explosion. And there are growing demands for change in the country. The French President Emmanuel Macron calls for urgent reform. Also coming up on the program, the Saudi Crown Prince is accused of sending a hit squad to Canada. A lawsuit outlines claims of a thwarted assassination attempt. And US attorneys have the NRA in their sights, triggering lawsuits designed to dissolve the gun rights group.
I'm Lee Wellings with the sports news as the NBA's biggest star stands up to Donald Trump. The president says he turns off when he sees social justice protests before games, but LeBron James says he couldn't care less. We'll hear from him this hour.
As the people of Lebanon grieve for the victims of Tuesday's blast, the French President Emmanuel Macron has been touring neighborhoods devastated by the chemical explosion. As despair increasingly turns to anger, people have been demanding change, with President Macron adding his voice to calls for urgent reform. The death toll from Tuesday's explosion has risen to 149, but it is expected to rise. About 5,000 people are injured. Many of them are being treated in hospitals that have been completely overwhelmed. Dozens of people are still missing or unaccounted for. And then more than 300,000 people have been displaced from their homes. Shopkeepers and residents are still clearing up the rubble that's littering streets and homes up to 8 kilometers away from the blast site. Well, Emmanuel Macron has called for a transparent international inquiry into Beirut's massive port explosion. The French president met with Lebanese political leaders after surveying some of the damage from Tuesday's blast. But he was also mobbed by residents in the city who are furious at their government and are demanding accountability.
What I know is that the people of Lebanon have electricity shut down every day, and it's not working. The provision of imports and exports has collapsed because of the financial system. So there are answers for the short term that we need. As we know, the answer is to fight corruption, reform the energy and electricity systems, the customs. We need transparency for imports and exports. We need reforms for all these sectors and insist on these changes quickly.
Well, public anger against Lebanon's ruling class is growing. Many hold them responsible for the economic collapse of the country. And as Al Jazeera's Zain Khodin now reports to us from the Lebanese capital, the state has been noticeably absent from the recovery operation.
Search and rescue teams are still digging through the rubble at Beirut port, the site of massive explosions that damaged or destroyed much of the Lebanese capital. Families are desperate for news about their loved ones. Dozens are missing. There is pain and grief. Zainab Meshek fears she will never see her husband Ali again.
I
don't know where he is. I haven't heard from him since 6 p.m. Monday. I want to know if he's alive or dead.
Rescue experts from abroad have started to arrive to help a country that wasn't prepared to cope with a disaster like this.
All of us are helping each other with the army to find more corpses. There's still a lot of destruction. We need to move destructed building to find if there is somebody else.
The blasts were felt kilometers away, killing dozens and wounding thousands. Buildings, homes, shops, all destroyed. 300,000 people displaced. Billions of dollars in damage. Investigations are focusing on possible negligence in storing tons of highly explosive material at the port.
Officials have promised assistance and compensation to those affected by the explosions, but driving around the city, the state is noticeably absent. In destroyed neighborhoods like this one, it is the people who are helping each other.
They are cleaning the streets, clearing the debris, and distributing food and water to those in need. Public anger against the political class many believe is responsible for Lebanon's near economic collapse is not new. Decades of corruption and neglect triggered an anti-establishment movement last October.
We've unfortunately gotten used to the state not being present for its citizens. We don't have proper electricity, we don't have proper garbage infrastructure, we don't have proper water infrastructures, and unfortunately the people have gotten used to it, but it's It's a time for change. We've been asking for change for quite some time, and I think this last catastrophe is going to make change for the country much better.
The priority now is to help the victims. Many are still in hospital in critical condition. Calls for accountability and justice are growing louder. For now, people are focused to rely on themselves.
I need money to manage myself. Nobody's paying. Can I leave everything to open and go? I cannot. To be truth, Yani. So this is why I'm here. I want to clean my house, at least to sleep. I'm sleeping out the street.
Some may call it resilience, but for many this is about survival. Nearly half the population of 5 million Lebanese were below the poverty line before this disaster. The situation has since got worse. Zena Khudr, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
Well, let's now speak to our correspondent Bernard Smith. He's also following the story in Beirut. And so, Bernard, just looking at Zaina's report, there's such a mixture of emotions that people are going through right now, still trying to process the shock of what has happened while also trying to repair their lives.
Well, we saw earlier on today when the French President Emmanuel Macron was down on the streets of some of the damaged parts of Beirut. There were people there shouting for the return of the French mandate. France was the colonial power here before independence, and it's because Macron, people have turned to Macron because he's essentially stepped into a void left by Lebanon's own political leaders. Macron was able to offer practical help in terms of rescue teams and financial aid and recovery aid, and was able to offer moral support. Lebanon's political leaders have not been able to offer anything. They've been conspicuous by their absence in comparison to Emmanuel Macron. So there is very real anger and very real frustration at the lack of assistance from the Lebanese government to this catastrophe that has hit the capital city. A wave that went out 3 kilometers across the city from the port, smashing, destroying pretty much everything in its midst. So real anger tonight. There's little help coming from the Lebanese government now.
Nearly 150 people killed, but that's expected to rise. Thousands of injuries, and then hundreds of thousands of people also left homeless. What have people been telling you throughout the day about their immediate needs right now?
Well, we've seen all day mainly armies of mainly young people with pickaxes, shovels and brushes. They're out trying at least to clean up. Almost everywhere you look, every building you look up to, the glass has been blown out. People are pinning up plastic sheeting in windows to try and give them some sort of privacy and protection from the elements. Those that have got homes or shells of homes to go back to. There are some 300,000 people who do not have homes to go back to. Many have got relatives elsewhere in the country. They might have been able to go into the mountains for cousins and relatives living up there, but there are other people without anywhere to go. And that frustration is manifesting itself tonight with a small outbreak of a protest near the Parliament building, not far from me here in the centre of Beirut. An indication really of the extreme frustration and powerlessness people are feeling because they aren't getting any assistance. I can also say that just in the last hour or so the Lebanese authorities have said they have detained 16 individuals in connection with their investigation into what led to this explosion. But of course, from the very top of the political tree, we haven't had any resignations or any admissions that they are responsible for what had happened here over the last more than 24 hours ago, Mary.
Thank you very much from Beirut, Bernard Smith. Well, many people are blaming the entire system for what has happened, the Lebanese confessional political system, for essentially leading the country into a serious deadlock. Of course, this was before the current disaster. There are 18 recognized sects in Lebanon, 4 Muslim, 12 Christian, the Druze sect, and then Judaism as well. Since its inception, Lebanon's whole governmental system has been built on power sharing between these different groups. Political leaders from each group have maintained their power and influence through a system of patronage networks. Critics say it's led to an entrenched and corrupt political class, which has paralyzed politics and prevented reform. There are also concerns about the power and influence of Hezbollah, which is sponsored by Iran and forms part of Lebanon's coalition government. Well, let's now speak to Rami Khouri, who's a professor at the American University of Beirut. He joins us by Skype from Boston. So, Rami, obviously, we've been speaking about what's happened in Lebanon and people trying to cope with it. But, of course, it's really, I suppose, a symptom of a system that has long been broken and riddled by corruption and negligence. There was a lot of fury on the streets of Beirut today. Is that likely to get worse?
It's definitely going to get worse. And to keep this in perspective, the sectarian power sharing system worked reasonably well in the middle of the last century during the great phase of nation building, state building all across the Arab world. And until around the 1990s, say the end of the Civil War, it was most people in Lebanon, their lives were getting better, broadly speaking. And so people went along with the system. But it was really in the last 25 years that the system has collapsed because it has become very corrupted, and it has allowed a lot of external influences from all different parties to manipulate people in Lebanon. And then just the expectations of the citizenry was so high in terms of basic services, electricity, water, garbage, education. But even that, the government couldn't meet it because the people in power were allowing corruption and misconduct and inefficiency to dominate everything they did, leading ultimately to the lack of any concern by the government for their own citizens, which we see here with the explosion. Since the explosion happened, one or two Lebanese officials tried to go downtown, talk to people. The Minister of Justice this morning was hounded out of the area where the explosion happened, and people yelling at a revolution, resign. People have no trust at all in the government, and they certainly don't trust its investigation now.
So how do you go from a situation where the government has lost all credibility with the people, although that was the case before this explosion happened, to then having some sort of reformulated political system, or at least a new independent government that's, I suppose, staffed with experts and technocrats that have absolutely no political and sectarian affiliation? How do you go from one scenario to another?
Well, this is the great challenge facing not just Lebanon, but much of the Arab world. Algeria, Sudan, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, Morocco, many Arab countries are facing similar challenges. How do you transition from a top-heavy system to autocratic system into a more genuinely democratic system that is also equitable in its social and economic policies? There's really only two ways to do it. Either you get rid of the old system by force, as happened in Tunisia, for instance, and build a new democracy through consensus, or you push the old system so hard that you force it to share power and negotiate a transition with you, which is what's happening in Sudan right now. Sudan is the most exciting place in the Arab world because of this 3-year transitional period with a government system that is half civilian, half military, jointly managing the transition to a full democracy. And that was forced on the military, who had absolute power. They did this because they saw they couldn't just keep shooting and killing their people who were demonstrating for simply decent citizen rights. Lebanon's best hope is to do that at some point. The power elite shows zero sign of being willing or able to do any of that. This is the problem. So we're going to see a lot of political mobilization.
I mean, just wondering, you're saying that the elite so far has been reluctant to, because obviously their interests are at stake, so they're not likely to relinquish or to want to change the current system. But now that you have this awful disaster that's taken place, can humanitarian aid or assistance be contingent on some sort of serious reform? Could it be used to bring about a turning point in Lebanon?
Sorry, somebody cut into your statement. Could what happen to bring about reform?
I'm just wondering if any humanitarian assistance or international aid could be tied to there being reform and serious political change in Lebanon.
Yes, many activists and political personalities are calling for this. I've written myself about a proposal to have a joint government and private sector and civil society commission to oversee the disbursement of aid and to monitor its spending so that you don't have aid being used to build a power station next to some minister's house or to buy your cousin a new car, which has happened in the past. So I think foreign aid, the humanitarian aid that's going to come in now, can be a crucial pivot to start forcing on the government a mechanism of decision-making that is shared between the state and some of the few honest people. There are honest people in the state, there are good people in the government, but they don't make the decisions now. So you can get some of those good people in the government with good people in the private sector working together. In other words, you share sovereignty. You de-sovereignize an authoritarian system and you make it share power with others, and together they make decisions for the benefit of all. This is not only a possible step for Lebanon, it can be a signal to the rest of the Arab world about, again, a transition mechanism, and then this can continue for other sectors of life where decision-making is done jointly.
Thank you very much, Rami Khoury, for joining us today.
Thank you.
You're watching the NewsHour live from London. Much more still to tell you about. Africa has passed 1 million coronavirus cases, but there are concerns there still isn't enough testing in many countries on the continent. Hiroshima marks 75 years since the first atomic bomb and calls for a nuclear weapons-free world. And then a bit later, this Formula One driver gets the green light to compete again after contracting the coronavirus. We'll have that story and much more with Lee in the sport. The Saudi Crown Prince is accused of dispatching a group of hitmen to Canada to kill one of his top former intelligence officials, Saad al-Jabri. The allegation was revealed in a lawsuit filed by al-Jabri in Washington. The hitmen were allegedly sent by Mohammed bin Salman just days after journalist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in October 2018. Al-Jabri is seeking damages from the Crown Prince for allegedly orchestrating an attempted extrajudicial killing and for violating international law. Mike Hanna is following the story from Washington and joins us now. Tell us more about the claims within the lawsuit.
Well, it's 106 pages in this particular lawsuit that goes into extensive detail about the composition of this alleged hit squad, the names of the individuals involved, and the links between Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, and those who allegedly were sent to assassinate Saad al-Jabri. He also speaks about a number of text messages that were sent from the Crown Prince to him, which started off by asking him to return to Saudi Arabia to ease the transition between himself and the former Crown Prince, and then it escalated into a series of threats saying that al-Jabri would be dealt with in one way or another. So it is exhaustive detail in terms of this case that is brought before the DC court. Al-Jabri making very clear that he and a number of others who are mentioned in the documents are targets for assassination by a Saudi hit squad under the orders of the Saudi Crown Prince.
And why was the case then filed on US soil instead of Canada?
Well, there is some US legislation that allows non-US residents or non-US citizens to file claims against leaders in other countries who are alleged to have committed torture or extrajudicial killings. So there is the legal basis and the legal ability to be able to bring such a case. But in addition, Saad al-Jabri, in his court papers, alleges that the hit squad actually assembled in the United States before attempting to enter Canada. So this is a crucial point which obviously provides a linkage towards the United States and allows allows justification for the case to be heard here. I must just mention briefly too that Saad al-Jabri's 2 children are allegedly being detained by Saudi officials in what he sees as human bait to lure him out of hiding. And only last month a group of US senators sent a letter to President Trump saying that because of al-Jabri's links to US intelligence in the past and his value to them, the US has a moral insistence to actually take argument against Saudi Arabia to get these children released and returned to their father. As yet, there's been no official response from President Trump.
All right, thank you very much with all the latest from Washington, Mike Hanna. Just want to get a bit more analysis on the story now with Afzal Ashraf from the Centre for Conflict, Security and Terrorism. Joins us live by Skype from Ashford in the UK. Now, if I could start by getting your initial assessment on some of the details and really the revelations contained within this lawsuit.
Well, I think the revelations in this lawsuit itself point to a tactic that al-Jabri has embarked on, and that I think is not just to put pressure and get some compensation from Mohammed bin Salman. It is because he wants to put pressure on the American government to put pressure on MBS to release his daughter Sarah and his son Omar, who are now in custody. I think the other thing that's very interesting is that if the hit squad or the alleged hit squad assembled in the US, they were picked up by Canadian border forces, even though they tried to come in through different kiosks, which suggests to me that there might have been a tip-off to the Canadian agencies, suggesting that these people were coming in for nefarious purposes. So that does suggest, if my guess is right, that there is some cooperation between the American agencies and the agencies to prevent what could have been allegations have any basis behind them.
And so, I mean, obviously there's a great deal going on in Washington right now. We're not far from an election, but how will Washington view these Saudi efforts against Mr. al-Jabri?
I think that Washington will view anything to do with Saudi Arabia through the prism of the very significant economic and defense relationships that they have. Certainly on the Khashoggi case, a great deal was said, but not a great deal was done after those revelations came to light. And I think in this case, this will be a very awkward situation for the American government. And I think that what they might be able to do in this case without causing too much harm is to put enough pressure on the Saudi regime to release Mr. al-Jabri's children, and also to extract some degree of assurance from the Saudi regime that he and other dissidents wouldn't be pursued. Because if they are pursued, if this alleged, and it must emphasize the alleged bit, if this alleged assassination attempt had succeeded, then it puts a great deal of pressure on the US, on Canada, and indeed on Europe in its fight against the alleged assassinations that the Russians have been carrying out on British soil and elsewhere. And so for those reasons, this takes on a very significant global political hue. And I think the American government will be weighing up those options, but no doubt that if this case is proven, and none of these allegations have been proven in court, but if the Washington District Court finds these allegations to be proven, then I think the American government will have very little choice but to put some pressure on the Saudi government to release Sarah and Omar, al-Jabri's children, and also to get some assurances that Western soil at least will be a no-go zone for any attempted assassinations or kidnaps.
All right, thank you for your analysis, Afzal Ashraf. Thank you for joining us on the NewsHour. I want to bring you a story from Nigeria. Dozens of anti-corruption protesters there have been arrested, accused of breaking social distancing rules. Tear gas was used against members of the Revolution Now movement. They were peacefully demonstrating in cities across the country. Police say the activists were cautioned about violating coronavirus restrictions before being released. Rights group Amnesty International has described the arrests as unlawful. The surge in coronavirus cases in Africa and a lack of testing is sparking growing concern from public health experts. The World Health Organization has warned the pandemic could overwhelm strained public health systems. The continent has recorded more than 1 million cases and at least 21,000 deaths. South Africa accounts for more than half of these cases. It also has the fifth highest number of infections globally, while 75% of the continent's infections are in just 5 countries: South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana and Algeria. Just 10 countries on the continent account for 80% of the new coronavirus testing taking place. Well, Dr. Regina Osi is an infectious disease specialist at the Arum Institute, joins us live by Skype from Johannesburg. And looking at these figures, I suppose what's really alarming about there being more than 1 million cases on the continent is the fact that these are just the figures in the absence of widespread testing.
Yes, for sure. I think that, of course, we always know that there are more COVID cases than there are people tested. That's true everywhere in the world because there are lots of people who remain asymptomatic and who also have COVID-19 disease. And therefore, you don't always have the full picture. But of course, it is very concerning that there are places where there's not a lot of testing and we're still seeing a rise in the number of cases. However, it's very difficult to predict what the implications of that, not testing, how the figures would look if they were doing more tests generally. But yes, it is a little bit concerning.
But I suppose the worrying thing about African countries compared to other parts of the world, perhaps in Europe and elsewhere, is that you have a health sector that is under a great deal of pressure and that has suffered really from underinvestment for decades.
Yes, that is true. I think that there has been considerable investment recently with the advent of the Global Fund and PEPFAR, for example, for TB, HIV and malaria. So there have definitely been recent investments that have been made across the board. But yes, the health systems generally are quite fragile and therefore have a difficult time dealing with things like these massive epidemics.
And it's really South Africa that currently accounts for 50% or more of coronavirus cases on the continent. How bad is the situation there, and could they end up sort of exporting it to other parts of the region?
Well, so currently our borders are still closed. So South Africa has had closed borders since March, and we don't have any movement in and out of the country, at least not movement of people. There's movement of cargo, but not movement of people. And so we're hoping that that's going to, of course, create an environment where cases are not being exported. South Africa is really, we are getting quite a lot of cases right now. We're probably going to get close to 1 million when this is over. But I think that we have seen a little bit of relief in the last week or so in terms of the number of cases being reported, also in terms of the hospital burden and the number of people who are in the hospitals and the percent occupancy of the hospital beds. So I think things seem to be getting a little bit better. It could be just spurious because, maybe people are not testing as much, or maybe there's just some other reason. But hopefully that trend continues. Right now it's just a trend, but hopefully the trend continues, and then we can see in a few weeks whether we're actually over the hump. But of course, it's still going to take a long time to get down back to zero. So if you look at where we are right now.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Regina Osi, for joining us there from Johannesburg. Ivory Coast President Alassane Ouattara says that he'll be running for a third term as president in the country's October presidential vote. His opponents say this would violate the country's constitution. So we can now speak to Ahmed Idris, who's following the announcement from Nigeria's capital, Abuja. Was Ouattara expected to make this announcement?
Well, for many Ivorians, they expected this. Remember when former Prime Minister Amadou Gon Coulibaly suddenly died on 8th July. The political equations in Ivory Coast, especially that of the ruling party, changed dramatically. And since then, there have been speculations as to whether or not Alassane Ouattara will contest for a third term, although his opponents say constitutionally he lacks the mandate to run for a third term unless the constitution is changed. Suddenly, Alassane Ouattara came back today, just before the Independence Day celebrations tomorrow, to announce to Ivorians that he is, in fact, going to run for a third term. He said he planned to retire peacefully and run his own foundation, but the events of July 8 really changed everything. He said, in his own words, man proposes, God disposes. So when members of his ruling political party asked him to run because of the current situation in the party, he accepted it. And he says it's a national call that he willingly accepts to run for a third time in Ivory Coast.
And he's not the only one. We also have another West African leader indicating that they're going to run for a third term despite protests.
Absolutely. Across the border in Guinea, its octogenarian leader, Alpha Condé, was selected by his party to run again. I remember for more than two years now, the delayed presidential elections in Guinea has attracted a lot of opposition demonstrations in Guinea, where dozens or hundreds of people, according to opposition members, have been killed during these demonstrations. Alpha Condé did not outrightly say he accepted to run, but everybody thinks that he will run. In his own words, he said, I hear you, the political party, the supporters, the nation, everybody, I will think about it. Those were the words when the party said that he's standing. He wants them. They want him to be their flag bearer in the presidential elections. So a lot of people in both Ivory Coast and Guinea, especially foreign partners, will be watching events closely in the two countries to see how things pan out. Earlier in Ivory Coast, for example, today, there were demonstrations of the Independent Electoral Commission headquarters in the capital, where supporters of former President Gbagbo, an arch-rival of Alassane Ouattara himself, protested that they want to see their man on the ballot, and they want also to see his name in the voters' register. The crowd was dispersed by security forces. In Guinea, as we said, there have been several demonstrations in that country wanting President Alpha Condé to step down at the end of his second term. And it's all pointing to the fact that President Alpha Condé will definitely run for another term in Guinea.
All right, thank you very much. All the latest on those political developments in West Africa. Ahmed Idris. More still ahead for you on the NewsHour. A coronavirus moratorium on evictions is lifted across 30 US states. Millions now fear they'll be left homeless. And the world's top tennis player returns to her indigenous roots to boost the sport in the community.
Hello, we've got some lovely summer heat spilling across much of Europe now, largely fine and dry. We have still got a nice little clutch of storms there just around the Balkans, but elsewhere you can see how the skies are opening up nicely, and we are going to see something of a heat wave into the northwest of Europe. We'll see temperatures in London getting up to 34 Celsius on Friday, staying well above the seasonal average. The average is actually 23 degrees in London. 3 consecutive days in a row where the temperature is 5 degrees or more above that average constitutes a heat wave. And that, you can see, is going to be with us for much of the week ahead. That warm sunshine extends across much of Europe. As I said, we do still have those showers down towards the southeast, just around the Balkans, southern parts of Italy. Greece seeing some rather lively showers as we go on through the next couple of days. But elsewhere, as you can see, more very hot sunshine coming through. Some absolutely lovely conditions there. Full value for the August temperatures then. We are going to see fine and dry weather too across northern parts of Africa. Still got those lively showers just around the Sahel, pushing across a good part of Sudan, South Sudan, through Chad, easing over towards northern parts of Nigeria, a little further north than they should be. Southern areas of Nigeria still in with a few showers, but largely fine and dry for many.
Welcome back. A look at the headlines now. French President Emmanuel Macron has visited Beirut 2 days after its massive chemical explosion. He's also called for a transparent international inquiry and says there needs to be a new political order in Lebanon. Well, the death toll from Tuesday's blast has risen to 149, but that's only expected to rise. People are still clearing up rubble littering the streets up to 3 kilometers away from the port. And another bit of news, a lawsuit filed in the US has accused the Saudi Crown Prince of dispatching a group of hitmen to kill one of his top former intelligence officials, Saad al-Jabri, in Canada. Now, early results from Sri Lanka's parliamentary election shows a big lead for the governing party. The Sri Lanka People's Front Party, led by the Rajapaksa brothers, who serve as president and prime minister, looks likely to consolidate power. The brothers have promised to repeal a recent constitutional amendment which reduced the powers of the position of president. Minal Fernandez explains the electoral process from outside a ballot counting centre in Colombo.
That's another set of results leaving the official counting centre here in the Colombo district, one of 4. Now, every single result that's tabulated is being sent, obviously, to the election authorities, the hard copy under strict security escort. Now, most of the work over the last 10 to 12 hours has been completed to tabulate all the votes here in the Colombo district. And this exercise is being replicated in the 22 districts throughout Sri Lanka. So basically, all the votes come into centralized counting centers in the district. They are tabulated and then officially communicated to the election authorities, who basically check them, they rubber stamp them, they basically officially recognize those results before they are announced. So far, from the early indications and the results we've seen, the SLPP, the party of the Rajapaksas, seems to have galloped ahead. 70% almost in terms of every single area that the results have been announced so far seem to have gone strongly in support of the Rajapaksas. The SBJ, which is the breakaway faction of the United National Party, seems to have come second, but a very far second, polling something like 1/4 of the SLPP party's total. Now, obviously, this situation will unfold over the coming hours as the true picture of the extent almost of the Rajapaksas' gains becomes evident. It's been a long day, obviously. The crowds you see behind me are basically election officials who've been manning these counting centers. They've had a long day, a meticulous manual counting process of each and every ballot paper, votes counted for the party, votes counted for candidates, which is another set of counting. So they've had long days. You can see a number of sort of transport buses on standby, and all waiting to get home, but having done their civic duty in helping the conduct of this August parliamentary election here in Sri Lanka.
I want to turn to Belarus now. The president says that several US nationals have been detained in the lead-up to the country's presidential elections on Sunday. But Alexander Lukashenko doesn't specify who was arrested or why. The leader is facing his strongest challenge yet to his 26-year rule. The run-up to the vote has been marked by a crackdown on opposition figures who Lukashenko accuses of plotting with foreign powers to topple him. Stat Varson is at a rally in the capital where thousands of opposition supporters have gathered despite the government's response to dissent.
This is unprecedented in Belarus. Thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of people have shown up here at this unauthorized rally after the authorities had banned the last official opposition rally held 4 days before these elections on Sunday. But the opposition leaders, 3 women who have combined forces against Lukashenko, have called on their supporters to show up here at this park, just at some government event. They didn't call it a rally, and so they did. They all came. They were all waiting for the main opposition candidate, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. But nobody knows where she is and if she actually showed up. Police was here, surrounding this whole park. They were here with with buses and trucks, and everyone was worried that people would be arrested today. But because of this massive turnout, police was just standing here and looking at it. Lukashenko is increasingly getting worried and is also increasingly clamping down on this unprecedented opposition force. More than 1,300 people have been detained during this whole election campaign. Even the campaign manager of the main opposition candidate was detained today. But these people are undeterred. They say they are beyond fear.
The Attorneys General of New York and Washington, D.C. have announced a lawsuit aimed at dissolving the powerful National Rifle Association. They're accusing the organization's leaders of financial mismanagement. New York's Attorney General Letitia James says years of corruption and misspending has undermined its ability to operate as a non-profit group. The NRA has described the lawsuit as a baseless, premeditated attack. Shahab Britansi is in New York and has more on the allegations.
$64 million siphoned off from the NRA's funds in about 3 years by Wayne LaPierre, the NRA's CEO, and 3 other executives. The Attorney General of New York says they used the NRA as their personal piggy bank to fund a lavish lifestyle. Wayne LaPierre's $500,000 worth of luxury private jet trips to the Bahamas, not just for him, but for his family and extended family when Mr. LaPierre wasn't even present, as well as siphoning off money to various friends, families, business associates in rather dodgy business deals. The Attorney General wants that money paid back, but she also says that the NRA has been so destroyed by this corruption, it can no longer be registered as a non-profit organization in New York. So this will now go to court. The NRA has filed a countersuit. This is likely to take a very long time. And as you suggested, the NRA is already suggesting in a very Trumpian fashion that this is simply a part of a witch hunt. Whatever happens to the NRA, the right might be thinking this is actually just what we needed just before the November election to get people to remember why they voted for Trump in the first place. And as far as this idea of dissolution is concerned, the dissolution of the NRA as a non-profit organization in New York, even Donald Trump didn't seem terribly bothered by that.
That's a very terrible thing that just happened. I think the NRA should move to Texas and lead a very good and beautiful life. And I've told them that for a long time. I think they should move to Texas. Texas would be a great place, or to another state of their choosing.
So this may or may not be the end of the NRA either in the short term or the long term, but historically we've seen that when the gun lobbies are under attack, their followers do mobilize.
Well, in other developments, the number of Americans seeking unemployment benefits dropped to 1.2 million last week. Hiring picked up in the months of May and June as states started lifting coronavirus restrictions after a record loss of 21 million jobs. That was in April. But more than 16 million Americans are now collecting unemployment benefits. A federal aid package of $600 a week in addition to the state benefit expired at the end of July. Politicians have so far failed to reach a deal to extend it. Well, then on top of that, millions of people who rent their homes across the U.S. could soon face eviction. Protections imposed in the wake of the pandemic are coming to an end in many states. Experts say it will almost certainly lead to the worst housing crisis in a generation. Andy Gallagher reports from Miami.
Even as unemployment rates remain at historic highs, the coronavirus pandemic shows no signs of slowing. With so many out of work in the midst of a health crisis, the spectre of mass evictions is now real. Temporary moratoriums meant to prevent renters losing their homes have been lifted in 30 states, and millions are facing a harsh reality.
The landlord here has started an eviction process against us when my mom lost her job, her full-time job, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm completely scared and frightened because I don't want to become homeless. I don't want my family to be split up and have to live in a homeless shelter.
Over the last few months, as job losses have grown, so too have the lines at food banks. That massive loss of income and increasing desperation not only affects renters, but landlords too.
Somebody who might own just one property and that's how they survive. They take the rental income to pay their bills, or they have a duplex and they might live in one half and rent out the other without the rental income. They cannot pay their bills.
This is absolutely a time to be generous and provide additional federal relief to people who've been laid off.
In Washington, negotiations between the Democratic Party and the Republicans continue over a new relief program. Some unemployment benefits officially ended last month with no new plans in place. That, combined with an end to protection from eviction, could have a devastating effect. Housing experts say without action, the US could witness a tsunami of evictions that may affect tens of millions of people. Without homes, many are forced to live with relatives or in shelters, increasing their risk of contracting COVID-19. The court system is overwhelmed hearing eviction cases, as a safety net designed to protect the most vulnerable seems to be straining. According to the data company Statista, 40% of Americans are now at risk of eviction. For some, it's already happened.
It's heartbreaking. You know, I lost my job, and when I went on with that, I lost everything else. No money, no nothing. I don't sleep well, or I stay worried about stuff all the time.
By some estimates, 40 million people could lose their homes, impacting poverty rates, homelessness, and the wider economy. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Miami, Florida.
Survivors of the world's first atomic bomb attack have been marking 75 years since it was dropped on Hiroshima. About 140,000 people were killed when US forces attacked Japan in the final stages of World War II. Rob McBride reports.
A poignant commemoration of the moment 75 years ago when the world entered the atomic age and a whole city was destroyed. With the numbers of the so-called hibakusha, the original survivors of the attack, declining each year, this is likely to be the last major anniversary they will attend in large numbers. Special precautions in place to protect them from the coronavirus that Hiroshima's mayor referred to as a new threat facing the world, accompanied by a worrying increase in nationalism.
We must never allow this painful past to repeat itself. Civil society must reject self-centered nationalism and unite against all threats.
At 8:15 in the morning local time, a single atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, exploded 2,000 feet above the center of the city, killing tens of thousands of people instantly, with tens of thousands more dying in the months and years that followed, many from radiation-related illnesses. Michiko Kodama was a child when the bomb was dropped. With the pandemic, innovative ways have been found for her and other survivors to share their stories with the present generation.
There is a sense that we don't have much longer to live. I'm now 82. I don't know when I won't be able to speak. So in some form, we need to preserve our stories.
3 days after Hiroshima, Nagasaki was attacked with a second bomb. Another anniversary with more survivors to mark it.
And in both cities, both among the generation who endured the attacks and also the generations that came after them, there's a strong peace culture that's really focused on abolishing nuclear weapons.
The experience of being the only country to be attacked with nuclear weapons helped shape modern Japan.
By urging action from each country, Japan will take the lead in the international community's efforts towards the realization of a world without nuclear weapons.
It's a goal still far from being realized, but one held still as strongly in the two cities that have suffered most from such weapons. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera.
More still ahead. Beavers return to Britain after a 5-year trial decides their dam building is good for the environment. And in sport with Lee Wellings, Tiger Woods goes in search of his 16th major title.
Yes.
Lee's He's here now with sport.
Mariam, thank you very much. The biggest star in NBA basketball, LeBron James, has spoken out against President Donald Trump and his regular criticism of player protests. Trump says he turns off games when he sees social justice protests before them and still believes players show disrespect when they kneel for the national anthem. But James, who plays for the LA Lakers, is one of those players and says he couldn't care less if the president watches or not.
I really don't think the basketball community are sad about losing his viewership. And I hope everyone, no matter the race, no matter the color, see what leadership that we have at the top in our country. And November is right around the corner, and it's a big moment for us as Americans. If we continue to talk about we want better, won't change, but the game will go on without his eyes on it.
Good news for the NBA is that the bubble at Disney appears to be working well with no new coronavirus cases in the latest round of testing. It means the action continues, and this was the defending champions, the Toronto Raptors, getting the better of the Orlando Magic. They've now won their last 7 games dating back to before the suspension. Now to another team from Toronto, the Blue Jays. After losing 10-1 the night before to the Atlanta Braves, they turned things around to win 2-1 on Wednesday. Major League Baseball has tightened up its COVID-19 protocols after that outbreak at the Miami Marlins. New rules include mandatory mask wearing in dugouts and also banning players from speaking at mealtimes. Golf's first major in 13 months is underway in San Francisco. Brooks Koepka aiming to complete a hat-trick of PGA Championships. He's just one off the lead held by Jason Day, and incredibly, Koepka is 74 under par in majors since 2016. That's more than 50 shots better than any other player. Tiger Woods has made a decent start, considering he's only played once since the PGA Tour returned. He's 2 under par, just 3 shots back, and that's his best start to a major since 2012. Woods is aiming to win major number 16 as he chases the overall record of 18 held by Jack Nicklaus. We're just over a month away from the planned start of the NFL season, and the league has unveiled a new measure to help keep players safe. They've been working on a mouth shield to go inside helmets. Sunglass manufacturer Oakley has helped design the shield, which it's hoped will limit transmission of COVID-19. Some players, though, have said they won't wear it. Dutch cyclist Fabio Jakobsen is serious but stable after 5 hours of facial surgery following that crash on the Tour of Poland. The 23-year-old went into the barriers at the finishing line on stage 1 after colliding with fellow Dutchman Dylan Groenewegen, who was disqualified and could face further sanctions. Jakobsen was awarded the victory. His team say he has no brain or spinal injuries. The plan is doctors trying to bring him out of an induced coma. Police are investigating the clash. To cricket, and Pakistan took control of the first test against England on day 2. Opener Shan Masood put them in a strong position at Old Trafford with his 3rd straight century, this time a career best, 156. Pakistan were 326 all out, and England were struggling at the close on 92 for 4. In the UK, Mexican Formula One driver Sergio Perez will be allowed to race at this weekend's 70th anniversary Grand Prix at Silverstone. The Racing Point driver tested positive for coronavirus ahead of last week's British Grand Prix, but health authorities in England now say he's completed his quarantine period. He will be tested and has to return a negative result before he can return to practice on Friday. The mass participation part of the London Marathon has been cancelled because of the pandemic. The race, which normally attracts almost 40,000 runners, was originally postponed from April until October, but now organisers will only run the elite race on a short loop, with Eliud Kipchoge looking for a 3rd straight win in that. Many of those athletes will be trying to qualify for the delayed Olympics next year, but the Olympic rings in Tokyo are being put away for now, at least. They'd been at the city's bay since early this year, but they've been hauled away on a barge for maintenance and will return next year. Had it not been for the pandemic, the Games would have come to a close this Sunday. Finally, women's tennis number 1 Ash Barty may have skipped this month's US Open because of her coronavirus fears, but she's been keeping busy. The 24-year-old has been promoting tennis in Indigenous communities in the far north of Australia. Barty is the first woman of Aboriginal heritage to top the world rankings since Yvonne Goolagong-Cooley. She spent the last week working with young players in the community after Tennis Australia announced this week an $80,000 fund for Indigenous tennis over the next 3 years.
It really does bring a smile to my face, and I feel like for me it brings back so many of my favourite memories from when I was a child growing up, how much tennis and how much tennis brought joy to my life and happiness to my life. It's a massive stepping stone, I think. For us, it's a pathway for young kids to see an opportunity, not just in tennis, but in education, in experiences, in all of these different things. And I think, it's incredible to see the pathways that are now available to Indigenous youth. And from there, it's opportunities where they can grow and develop as people and in whatever profession they choose.
And that's all from Ash Barty and from me.
Thank you very much, Lee. So just one final story to bring you on the NewsHour. After 400 years, beavers have been allowed back into the wild in England. These semi-aquatic animals were given permanent right to remain on the River Otter in East Devon. It follows a 5-year trial that showed their dam-building activities were good for wildlife and for people. Beavers were hunted to extinction in Britain more than 4 centuries ago for their meat, fur, and also a substance they happen to secrete called castoreum, which is used in food, medicine and perfume.
To work alongside with our farming and our healthy and sustainable food production, then natural management systems like this that the beavers can provide are one of the answers that farmers could be paid to have the beavers on their land.
Also, there's more on everything we're covering on our website. aljazeera.com is where you need to go. You can watch us live there as well, but I'll be back in a couple of minutes with a full bulletin for you. I'll see you very shortly.